On February 24, 1986, John Rutten spent all day trying to reach his wife, 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen. The young woman never answered any of her husband's many phone calls. Pulling into the garage of their home in the Los Angeles area, John noticed broken shards of glass on the ground. He also discovered that the BMW car he had given his wife a few months earlier was gone. On February 24, 1986, John Rutten spent all day trying to reach his wife, 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen. The young woman never answered any of her husband's many phone calls. Pulling into the garage of their home in the Los Angeles area, John noticed broken shards of glass on the ground. He also discovered that the BMW car he had given his wife a few months earlier was gone. Rutten then noticed that the front door to the apartment was ajar. A moment later, he saw his wife lying motionless on the floor. There was no pulse. The detective assigned to investigate the case was Lyle Meyer. He noticed electronic equipment stacked in the living room next to Rasmussen's body. Whoever had committed the crime had intended to leave with these items, but for some reason had not taken them. John Rutten, Sherry's husband, was questioned. After only a few days of investigation, it was announced that what happened to Sherry Rasmussen was a botched burglary, and the killer was a random person who did not know his victim. More than 20 years later, it became clear that the case was not as simple as it may have seemed at first glance, and the killer had personal scores to settle with Sherry Rasmussen. John Rutten and Stephanie Lazarus were students at the University of California, Los Angeles. Rutten was studying mechanical engineering and Lazarus was studying political science. They were active and likable young people with a bright future. Rutten and Lazarus began dating. After graduation, John became a computer programmer, and Lazarus became an LAPD officer. Rutten later met Sherry Rasmussen, a recruiting director at Glendale Medical Center. At a 25th birthday party Lazarus threw for Rutten, he told her about Rasmussen, admitting that they were in a serious relationship. In desperation, Lazarus wrote a letter to John's mother. "I am truly in love with John, and his confession just killed me. I wouldn't want our relationship to end this way. I don't think I will ever understand his John Rutten's decision." Rasmussen and Rutten began dating and soon moved into a rented apartment together. After the events with Rasmussen, Rutten admitted that he and Lazarus had met several times before they married to end their relationship in a nice way. But Lazarus became even more attached to John and continued to invite him to visit. Her constant contact with John bothered Sherry, but Rutten assured her that he and Lazarus were nothing more than friendship. At one point, Stephanie came to work with Rasmussen to tell her, "If I don't get John, no one will." 3 months after the wedding, Sherry was murdered. The LAPD forensic examiner found a bite mark on the girl's arm. A janitor at the couple's apartment complex later told police he found the woman's purse, which was later identified as belonging to Sherry Rasmussen. A maid who was cleaning the floor above said that around 12:30 p.m., she heard what sounded like two people fighting and then something falling. Although neighbors heard screaming, they decided not to call police. The burglar was supposedly taking out electronics when Rasmussen bumped into him and a fight ensued. The gun was cocked through a quilted blanket, probably to muffle the sound of gunshots. Later, another apartment in the same neighborhood was broken into, and electronic equipment was stolen. One of the two suspects was armed with a handgun, a .38 caliber handgun, the same one used in the Rasmussen case. Detective Meyer's partner, Steve Hooks, thought the bite mark on Sherry's arm was very unusual, because bites during a fight are much more commonly inflicted by women, while most burglars are men. Police found Rasmussen's missing car 20 kilometers from her home. The only item stolen was the couple's marriage certificate. Rutten was ruled out as a suspect and moved away from Los Angeles after the murder. He remarried 5 years later. Rasmussen's father reported his daughter to police about threats his daughter was receiving from police officer Stephanie Lazarus. But for obvious reasons, the woman was questioned and released. The case stalled as none of the suspects were ever identified. Sherry Rasmussen's father tried for several years to get the case reopened. In 2004, forensic scientist Jennifer Francis found a missing piece of evidence in the case, a cotton swab with DNA taken from a bite mark. The saliva and bite mark were identified as belonging to a woman, proving the original male robber theory wrong. In 2009, the LAPD reopened the case. The robbery in the Sherry Rasmussen case was ruled a staged robbery to throw the police off the trail. Detectives finally took an interest in Stephanie Lazarus and decided to continue the investigation. Rutten's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, came to John's house several times the night before the murder. It was also determined that the glass on the ground that Rutten saw was shattered by a bullet coming from inside the house, not from outside as one would expect in a burglary. Suddenly, detectives had a prime suspect in what was now believed to be a premeditated murder: Stephanie Lazarus, a fellow LAPD detective. On the day of the Rasmussen murder, Lazarus was absent from work. Just days after the crime, she reported her gun stolen. The woman was believed to have disposed of the crime weapon on her own. Investigators took DNA from a disposable coffee cup and were able to match its result to a sample taken from a bite mark on Rasmussen's arm. After Lazarus was arrested, teams of police officers began searching her home. Her diary from the mid-1980s was found, with numerous references to her love for Rutten and her depression over his engagement to Rasmussen, and no mention of the theft of her gun. An analysis of Lazarus's computer showed that she had searched John Rutten's name on the internet several times in the late 1990s. After her arrest, Lazarus was allowed to take early retirement from the LAPD. A bail hearing was not held for nearly 6 months. The judge set the amount for bail at $10 million in cash. He said Lazarus could have risked fleeing the country by obtaining the weapons through her husband. The trial began in early 2012. In Los Angeles County Superior Court, prosecutors argued that Stephanie Lazarus's motive was jealousy over Sherry Rasmussen's relationship with John Rutten. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. She is currently serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women. Lazarus will be eligible for parole in December 2034. She has tried several times to appeal her case, but appellate courts have upheld her sentence.